So this is our last example for a comparison-focused analysis. In this set of arguments, one argument has a definite conclusion, while the conclusion for the argument says it's not rational to take a definite position. The word count for the analytical paragraph only is 330 words, and you can see that the paragraph that I'm referencing here, so the word count is only for this part. You will see that it is described as outstanding in terms of performance and that the grader score would be 95 to 100 points. I might even give this student 105 points because of how thorough and detailed and exact and compelling their discussion is. I'm not going to repeat this information. I already went over that information in the first video focused on analysis where you're comparing. I'm not going to repeat information that I've given in terms of what this example does or does not include. We're going to go straight into the actual objective analysis paragraph. So here, and take note, you now have 3 examples of what your first sentence might look like per the page 2 instructions of the step 1 download for task 4A. This says in this paragraph, I'm going to focus on a major comparison I have come to see in our respective arguments. So again, notice it's in the first person, it's friendly, but it's still professional. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight this to make this just much more visually clear. So we'll put that in green. Note my claim that, so they're directing their peer to observe with them something that they observe in one of their responses. My claim, so I know who they're going to focus on. Again, when you're introducing the evidence, I do like if you add your own name. So they could have said, note in my claim, they could have said, I, Anthony, stated that. Okay, now if you don't put your name, that's fine. I just like it if you can. It's harder to do it with this introduction, but it can be done. It just takes a lot more work. Note my claim that, I guess you could also put in parentheses, you could do something like, note that my claim, you could put Anthony's. Just do that once though. I kind of don't like that, but this also meets my preference that you do include a name when you're introducing the evidence. I just don't want you to start sounding like you're talking in the third person, speaking in the third person. Okay, so note my claim, Anthony, note my claim, and probably really this should be Anthony's, that, and really I should have a comma here. Nothing can have full proof of anything, on anything, no matter the research, comma, and your claim that, comma, there have been various test studies and experiments that have tried to prove these claims to be true, but the results are almost always inconclusive. Okay, so this is a good example of how it is possible to cite 2 statements from 2 different arguments in one sentence. That said, be very careful. Most of the time, it's better to have an introductory clause, present your evidence, your quotation from your own response, and end that sentence with a period, and then start a new sentence to introduce the piece of evidence from your peer's response that you will introduce. So that's my recommendation, is that you have separate sentences, separate introductory clauses for each piece of cited evidence. Now, again, notice the language. Note my claim. Observe how I make. They're inviting the reader to follow along with them. They're saying, look, see this, see that. So think about how if you were, out on vacation and you were out with a friend and you're like, ooh, look at this, look at that. Did you see that? So you're calling attention when you're out on vacation maybe to whatever you're experiencing in a culture or a new geographic setting or even at a museum or something like that. But this is what this peer is doing explicitly in how they are wording their transitional statements, their clauses, their introductory clauses. They say, observe how I make use of the word full to talk about proof in relation to what research can show or reveal about anything, much less which of the conflicting claims. A little typo like that would not be a big deal. I already talked about, typos and, how many are tolerated on my part before I start taking off. About wearing a mask in the virus are true. So notice here in this sentence is they're saying, hey, they're unpacking a quoted statement from their own argument. And they're saying, let's focus on this word from my statement. And then they're adding insight, right? They're revealing new information, deepening understanding of how they're using that word without merely repeating what they said in the sentence that has the word full in it. Now look at what they say. Again, a very nice transitional phrase here. Also, it could be considered an introductory clause. Now take into consideration. Okay, so that's two instances. So at this point, if I saw that mistake one more time, like they forgot the ending of a word, so there's an issue with not word choice, but word usage, using the correct version of the word. If there was a third instance, then I might take off points. Two instances and a response that is this long, this thorough, I'm not going to take off. Now, let's say your response was only a third as long, like you only had 33% of this. Well, then more points would be taken off because there's more mistakes and less discussion, okay? Oh, and by the way, I forgot to highlight, right? So I'm going to highlight this in blue. Like, hey, Dr. Carrillo, look, I'm following the steps, right? Okay, so again, they're saying now take into consideration, okay, so observe how I make use. Now they're saying now take into consideration that Grammarly.com explains that foolproof. So again, we have a nice transitional phrase here. So anytime I'm pointing out to you introductory clauses, transitional phrases, I am talking about something that I mentioned on page 1 of the written assignment document from step 1 for this task 4A component of this assignment. And that is there should be fluidity. Your response should be coherent. Now take into consideration. Okay, so then they are going to talk about a word. So they put in quotation mark means, and then they properly put quotation marks around information that they are quoting. Even if you just reference and paraphrase from an outside source, which you shouldn't do too much of, you need to make sure that you give due credit so that you don't get a 0 for this because you plagiarized, whether intentionally or unintentionally. You might want to look at the FAQ section in the course menu bar to remind yourself of 8 different kinds of plagiarism so that you don't intentionally or unintentionally commit plagiarism, because I don't make a distinction between intentional and not intentional. You do it or you don't, and then there's a penalty if you do. Okay, so by Merriam-Webster, so simple, plain, or reliable as to leave no opportunity for error, misuse, or failure. I skipped a part. Grammarly explains that foolproof means infallible or so simple or well-made that nothing can go wrong, and that its synonyms are reliable, sure, guaranteed, and flawless. Notice here they did not quote a complete statement, but the way that they incorporated the part of a statement in Grammarly.com, they still communicate a complete thought because of how they set up their sentence as a whole. Note also, and technically this should have commas right here, but I wouldn't take off for that if you did that like only once. The definition provided by Merriam-Webster. So simple, plain, or reliable as to leave no opportunity for error, misuse, or failure. So this is obviously for the same word or phrase, foolproof. Okay, so then we've got with this explanation and definition in mind. And again, they're adding coherence. Look, they're saying, okay, now this is saying, I've just given you an explanation and definition. Let me reveal something to you in light of that. So this is a lovely transitional sentence that is binding what they said before to what they're going to say now. If it needs to be bound, sometimes we want to contrast what we're about to say with what we said, so we would have a different transitional clause or statement or phrase, or a different introductory clause or phrase or statement. So with this explanation and definition in mind, we can see how my use of foolproof shows how I think scientific research can go wrong, is not necessarily reliable or sure or flawless. Notice how the student is quoting and embedding words from the definition that they quote from Grammarly.com or Merriam-Webster, kind of like an argument by definition. So in other words, they have an argument within an argument. In other words, at least some of my reasoning shows that I think even scientific research can be mistaken, has room for error, or fails us in some way, maybe even through misuse. So again, you see that they are explicitly calling our attention to the fact that they are using words that name fundamental and powerful concepts to the word that they are defining, foolproof, to what? Back up the claim that what they have in blue really is evidence to back up the claim in terms of what they have in green. Okay, so then they say, in other words, so here's where you can paraphrase, but they're adding new insight. They're making sure that we understand something. So they're not merely repeating. They're either adding new insight or they're rephrasing something to make sure we understand it, but they don't go on to then rephrase it again. In fact, they add even some more information. They bring in another key term from one of their definitions that they use to support what is in blue and ultimately what is in green. In light of all this, this is a lovely introductory clause. They're saying, I am going to offer you in a conclusion, and there might be other minor conclusions. And of course, what you have in green is your main conclusion. Even in your blue, that's an implied minor conclusion because you're saying that this supports the claim that this really is evidence for what you're supporting here. But here, they're saying, in light of all this, in other words, the definitions and how the definitions apply to something I said, I would like to argue that your use of almost always inconclusive to describe previous attempts to prove a claim about mask wearing is true, so that should be E, connects to what I was thinking about scientific research not being foolproof. So what they were doing here is they were really trying to make the case that something they said does link up to what the peer said, but they had to do quite a bit of work to argue for this. For your use of almost always inconclusive shows that you think that studying, testing, and experimenting, all forms of research, cannot in themselves always guarantee. So look at what they're doing here, quoting a word from a definition. Let's see, hold on. Well, they're not quoting so much. I mean, the words that they quote here, it's actually from the list of synonyms, right? But that's okay. So they're not quoting a word from a definition, or they're not mentioning the word from a definition, but from a list of synonyms from the source from which they do get a definition. So here's the word guaranteed. So in other words, they're consciously, explicitly binding reasoning with the definition. So if you do use a definition to support a claim of similarity or difference, a claim of contrast or comparison, don't just plop down the definition. You need to embed important words in the definition into more statements that provide reasoning, explaining how the definition supports what you have in blue, supporting what you have in green. For your use, okay, so we already have that part. To guarantee the truth of any claims presented by those who engage in said activities. In other words, it is, here we should have, it is not, oops. It is not unreasonable to interpret you as saying that research, at least when it comes to mask wearing, is not always foolproof. Okay, so now they really bring it full circle. They really needed this last sentence to make the reasoning valid, right? So they give the definition for foolproof. They talk more about how foolproof, what it means in their own argument, and then they make the argument that their peer was also, what he has to say also connects to the idea or concept of what it means for something to be foolproof or for what it means for something to not be foolproof. This last statement was really required to carry the argument all the way through. Without it, the argument is incomplete. That is, the argument ultimately for what's in blue, for what's in blue and ultimately for what's in green. Notice that they say it is not unreasonable, lovely hedge. We call those hedges in logic and argument and rhetoric. And notice that they don't merely repeat something they've already said. They're drawing the full implications of something. This adds new insight into what they are discussing per the arguments and the ideas and the comparison.